of our last day of Congress. And today we will enjoy a lecture given by Professor Arminas Ragauskas. And the title of the lecture is, Do We Need to Create in Order to Invent? So I will briefly introduce Professor Ragauskas. He is a head of Health Telematics Science Institute at Kaunas University of Technology. He is a board member of European Union Research Group Brain and IT, board member of Association Scientia Liberia, an inventor and real entrepreneur because he developed high-tech industrial and biomedical devices for global market and established successful businesses. And he has developed more than 150 inventions patented in United States, Japan, European Union, Canada, and Australia. Professor is an author of textbooks for master and PhD students. He is a supervisor of PhD students, initiator and leader of international research and development projects. He was a visiting professor at universities in United States, in UK and Belgium, and an invited speaker at international scientific conferences in Europe, America, and Asia, and of course in Lithuania. So I would like to welcome you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks for a nice and kind introduction, but this is not about me, you know, and I'm surprised. Good sunny morning, ladies and gentlemen. Why my talk has the title, Do We Need to Create in Order to Invent? Because I remember my young days in London. I was a fellow, young and enthusiastic fellow of British Council, together with other young fellow, famous Estonian philosopher Andrus Park, who passed away too young. And I remember one of his seminars in King's College in London. And the title of the seminar was, Does the Philosophy of History Need History? I like this title. And title of my talk is inspired by Andrus and by his approach to philosophy of creativity. Let us start from definitions in order to understand each other. Why creativity is here? Because one of keywords of this nice conference is creativity. Why can I talk about creativity? I'm an inventor. I'm inventing, I'm patenting of novel, valuable, and previously unknown technological solutions. And perhaps somebody can think that this is creativity. Okay, I will not answer this question, is this creativity? But what about that short definition? Is this definition accurate, precise, and complete? Very wide consensus exists that creativity is the capacity to produce original and valuable items. But fortunately, I find a little bit extended definition, and the last word is very important, because flair is the bridge between this definition and modern neuroscience. Modern neuroscience is my field of activity. I'm looking to subconsciousness as an instrument of, let us say, creativity. And I have to say that modern neuroscience, after 2, 3, 5 years, will explain a lot about this phenomenon. Not today, but singularity point when intelligence will be finally explained by neuroscience is close. Discovery, even much shorter definition, to find something unknown. Is this definition complete? Innovation. Invention is just an instrument for innovation activity, and innovation is needed for opening new market niches or for competition in already existing markets. And my everyday activity is to work on innovations, sometimes on radical innovation. Okay, let us look to definition. You can find in literature more than 200 definitions of innovation, more than 100 definitions of creativity. I like short and, let us say, more or less accurate definitions which can be used as instrument in our life. In this definition, innovation is value-adding technological solution which is accepted by the market and which satisfies the needs of society in a better way than previous technologies. Okay, we have here important word, technology. Technology, according to very modern American definition, technology is organization of knowledge for practical purposes. If you will think about that short definition, you will feel how deep it is. I like this definition. And this talk today in our historical aula is always great emotion to speak here. It's very personal, based on my personal experiences. And my list of inventions is long enough. I never thought that I will be able to get more than 160 patents, to invent more than 160 novel technological solutions, but that happened somehow. According to definition of innovation, we need to invent better technology in order to enter the global market and to compete in the market with novel product, service, or process. And case one is about our invention of special ultrasonic flow meter in market which is overcrowded by players. But this market is very attractive. 7.9 billion USD market value and growth 7.2% in 5 years. The question is, can we invent better ultrasonic flow meter in order to enter this huge and growing market? Is creativity needed for that? Let us look to situation. Let us start from patent analysis. If you will open European patent search instrument in internet, you will find 2,294 already patented ultrasonic flow meters. Is this figure, is this number motivative? Jesus, sorry for that.
It's happening all the time, isn't it?
Okay. Just a moment. In order to switch off this device, I need to push 5 buttons. Okay. My point is that if you have 2,294 patents, every patent lawyer will be in trouble if you will ask him to patent something new. But if you will look to existing technological solutions, you will find ultrasonic flow meters, a lot of ultrasonic flow meters with rectangular pipes and big players in the market like international corporations, Siemens, and Danfoss, and many, many others. You will find a lot of products, ultrasonic flow meters with round pipes. And let us go to semiotics now. You have 2 symbols here, which represent cross-section, shape of cross-section of that pipe. And 2 first symbols are patented 2,294 times. And something is missing. If you are contemplating on 2 symbols, it is easy to find that triangular shape of cross-section is somehow missing. And our innovation in patent, first ultrasonic flow meter with triangular cross-section of the pipe, is a result of contemplation on symbols. And why this technical solution, why this triangular section of cross pipe is much better comparing with other pipes already existing in the market? A long story about physics, but this picture, this a little triangular picture with some figure inside. That figure inside explains how ultrasonic beam can be transmitted through that let us say, special pipe in the best possible way. In this technological solution, hydrodynamics or gas flow communicates with ultrasound in the best possible way. Not achievable solution in all other shapes of the pipe. And European patent issued in 2008, 7 years old. And product with all necessary accuracy, precision, CE mark, and other parameters, 10 times wider measurement range. That means we are saving metal, we are saving many pipes, which covers the same range by existing technological solution. Serial production, I like that. Serial production in Kaunas. And what is the business case one? 72,000 units sold until now, 45 million euro income from this strange technological solution. Simple triangular pipe. What questions after that? Why the authors, up to 6,000 ultrasound professionals of more than 2,000 patented inventions, never thought about triangular pipe? Why? Are they blind according to Darwinian theory of creativity? Is their subconsciousness somehow blocked according to Poincaré? Is my contemplation of triangle just a symbol? And our finding of opportunity to invent an act of creativity? Why I am asking and not answering? Good philosophy always asks, but never answers. Case 2. Just 2 cases. Case 2, invention of non-invasive absolute ICP value meter. What a problem. You see in the middle of the text short equation. CPP is equal ABP minus ICP. CPP is cerebral perfusion pressure, driver of the blood in your brain. And this very important physiological parameter is equal to arterial blood pressure, ABP, minus intracranial pressure, ICP. Intracranial pressure is the pressure inside the skull in your brain. If you have trauma, brain swells, pressure increases, and swollen brain compresses your veins, outflow of blood flow, and you are dead or you are in vegetable state if nobody will treat you. The problem is huge. This problem causes, we had trauma. TBI, traumatic brain injury, costs to American society, European society, almost 100 of billions of dollars in the year. Annual costs are terrible. Treatment of traumatic brain injury is also a big problem. This is, let us, frontier of neuroscience. And if we will look to possibility to measure ICP non-invasively, you will find symbol, very ancient symbol of the pair of scales. And what is the deep meaning of the pair of scales? This is first measurement instrument in this planet. And after invention of this instrument in ancient Egypt, you can see other ideas which follows from that invention. Idea about plus minus infinity, idea about the deep meaning of zero. If you will look to that plus minus infinity, like this balance of the pair of scales, what is the meaning of zero? Zero means nothing? No. This is the central point. The central point which shows you the balance. The balance between minus infinity and plus infinity. If you will look to the great ideas in physics, you will find principle of Dirac. Dirac said that what is the meaning of vacuum? Nothing? No. Vacuum is the balance between material things and anti-material things. A lot of other consequences after that. Balance is very basic idea in politics, Jesus Christ. Keep the balance between West and East, etc., etc., etc. And what is the main, why this intracranial pressure until now is measured invasively, to drill the hole in the skull and to implant terrible sensor in your brain to create little bleeding here, and neurosurgeons, they're happy to do that, and etc., etc. Because nobody was contemplating on the symbol of scales. On the left side, you see very, very old idea, very old patent. This patent appeared in America in 1904 in Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, and the author, Joseph Erlanger, got his Nobel Prize in 1944. This is the principle of non-invasive measurement of arterial blood pressure, to apply external pressure and to compress the artery here and to balance two pressures. Pressure inside there, everybody knows how to measure arterial blood pressure. And 1904, and nobody was able to invent non-invasive intracranial pressure measurement based on the same excellent principle. Why this principle excellent? Fits to everybody, to young, to old person, independently on age or pathology, fits to everybody without calibration. This is metrological term, let us forget that, but the same principle we applied to measurement of intracranial pressure at first time in this planet. This is our patent. Appeared where? In America, and in 1999. What happened after that? Here we see our products which are already ready to be sold in Europe. We have all accreditation certifications. This left a little bit bigger box. And on the right side of the slide, you see touchscreen based all-in-one device, which is ready for sales in America. We started FDA procedure, Food and Drug Administration certification procedure for this device, and we will enter the market in the next year. Here you see our devices in clinical reality, in neurosurgical intensive care unit. Patient is comatose, mechanically ventilated, and we are trying to save his life. And product already is validated by comparative prospective clinical studies in Lithuania, Switzerland, USA, Germany, Sweden, Finland. Clinical studies were funded by the US Department of Defense, Department of the Army, NASA, National Space Biomedical Research Institute, European Commission, Lithuanian and Swiss agencies. Business case 2. Today we have 10 patents granted in the US and EU. Device, as I already said, has CE mark approval for sales in EU, and FDA process has been launched. We established Vitamed Corporation company in Boston, USA, because the market in America is much bigger than in Europe and Japan. And UAB Vitamed in Kaunas. Again, our goal is to manufacture devices in Lithuania and to export to the other countries. And we have no competitors in the global market. And business potential is a few billion USD. And we are attracting venture capital for that more or less successfully. And questions after case 2. As I mentioned before, non-invasive arterial blood pressure measurement technology has been invented many years ago. Why nobody was able to invent non-invasive ICP meter in more than 100 years? Our contemplation on an ancient symbol of the pair of scales and innovative solution of ICP measurement problem, the act of creativity. To conclude, my inventor's practice confirmed that creativity is too general term, not very instrumental, in order to explain an act of invention, an act of organization of knowledge. That means if you are organizing in a novel way, you are creating novel technology, creating Jesus. Big mistake in my talk. And my experience says that we rather discover opportunities given by nature and civilization. We manipulate by components of nature and civilization in order to form something novel and something valuable. When we invent, my feeling is that I'm not a creator, I'm a manipulator. And I would say that it is better to leave creativity to big creator and wizards, as Plato proposed 2,500 years ago. And I am very optimistic about modern neuroscience. Modern neuroscience is close to discovery of the algorithms of subconscious activity and plasticity of the human brain, which will explain the phenomenon of technological inventions. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you too.
Okay, it's not working for one, but I think everybody here. Thank you, Professor, for your very interesting insights and the experience you shared today with us. And even you mentioned that a good philosopher just asks and never answers. Nonetheless, we now have time for answers and questions. So we would hope that you will step down and still share some insights about answering questions.
Okay, question from my side.
We can do this.
Thank you for your presentation. I think you made a strong case about that creativity is not really needed for invention. However, I have a point regarding what you started your presentation regarding neuroscience being close to discovering what the role of consciousness and pinpoint consciousness, and especially at the end, subconsciousness. One of the lessons I've learned from semiotics, in particular, is that both consciousness and subconscious is not really in the brain. For the most part, it's outside of us. It's a collective experience that exists among all people. So, for instance, let me give you an example. Actually, I did work for 1 year in Caltech as a research assistant for Professor Christoph Koch, who had a lab to find out about the neurocorrelates of human consciousness. Now, his method was very reductionistic. Basically, he said, okay, human consciousness is too broad of a thing to discover. Let's get us to the minimal point in which we would detect what is human consciousness. And he did vast experiments. He had lots of fMRIs. He did for 10 years. I was just part of it for 1 year, but we did runs tons of experiments. I want you to read his latest book that he has come out. He gave up that experiments altogether. 2 years ago, he published a book, and I think the title is something like The Confession of a Neuroscientist. In it, if you read, he shows up more of a mystic than a scientist. Basically, what he says is that consciousness, to my understanding, is something not humans, not even animals or beings, but distributed in everything. Even rocks, even inanimate objects. They possess consciousness. This is what he claims. That's a neuroscientist. And if you read, all the studies that, the psychological studies in subconsciousness, starting with Jung, Carl Jung claim basically is the subconsciousness is not in humans. It's a collective, distributed phenomena. The whole archetypal, theory basically, it taps in this phenomena that even human subconsciousness is distributed among people. It's not in the brain per se. So I think, I'm using this as an example to tell you probably the neuroscience is really never close to discover this, that where is the source of creativity. It's neither, I don't think it's in consciousness, probably most of it is subconsciousness, but most of it, if it's subconsciousness, as somebody said, if you want to know what will be trend or invention next time, is as though guessing what will be your next dream. This is obscure as
Yes,
it is.
I agree with you. Yeah.
Thank you.
My comment, not answer, but my comment. First of all, when you are talking and when you are thinking in this way, you have to take into account that your scientific instruments, let us say MRI, imaging device, needs to be approximately 500 times, needs to have 500 times better resolution in order to see what is happening in your subconscious part of the brain, in the neural network, which is plastic. By training, you can change that algorithm of the neural network. And, but we are going this way. If you will compare, I used to stay in MRI device hours and hours inside the device. My brain has been scanned many times, and the conclusion was that my brain is very rigid. Nobody knows why. Without tumor in the brain. Okay, but MRI device which I used in Chicago had 3 Tesla magnet. Now we have our civilization created 7 Tesla magnet. 7 Tesla means 4 times better resolution. 2 times stronger magnet, 4 times better resolution. Next step will be 30 Tesla. And after 5 years, we will have possibility to look deeply enough into neural networks. And thinking of your argument about, let us say, consciousness existing everywhere, I think that this is...
I'm not saying that.
Okay, this guy said, guy from Caltech said that, yeah. Okay. He is really, he is right, but if you will interpret his argument by GNR, by our genes, by all that double spiral, because our genes are the same. Because of that, we feel that our consciousness, our subconsciousness, going from individual to individual, somehow is the same. And if you will think even deeper about our genes, you will find that our genes are much older than universe, than our planet. Why? How? Many questions, no answer.
Thank you for comments. We still have some more comments.
Thank you for bringing something from my ancestors. And I was born in Egypt, by the way. So it's...
Oh, yeah.
Thank you. The whole idea about measuring the heart against feather is to make awareness that the heart has to be as light as feather. Having said that, I wanted to start with that slide because I'm thankful that you're bringing this up. The whole idea about the brain being the seat of intelligence is really a new phenomenon that didn't exist 5,000 years ago and prior to that. As you know, ancient Egyptians actually got the brain out of the nose, which I don't know how in the hell they did that, but they sucked the brain out, took everything in the body out. The only thing left in the mummy is the heart. And they call it the intelligence of the heart, and they are not talking about intelligence as the intelligence that we define today is what we call a spatial intelligence. So I'm a little bit, I don't have the answer like you two. I'm struggling. The 2 things that come to mind, one is, it is what our colleagues here said that consciousness is everywhere. Jung call it collective consciousness. American Indians, First Nation, they call it supreme being, etc., etc. No one really knows exactly what conscious is. The best book that I have ever read that describe what named as integrative consciousness by Gene Gibson, a wonderful philosopher. People actually reject him as a semiotician, but he's incredibly good. And the book called The Ever-Present Origin, Gene Gibson. So he talks about integrative consciousness. Now, going back to the notion of creativity, I'm having a hard time when not referring to what you're saying because it makes a lot of sense. Creativity is not necessarily toward object. It's a way of thinking that in my field we call it design thinking. And creative thinking does not necessarily lead to object or manifestation of object. Innovation does, and that's what you talked about. So to go to the notion that we leave creativity to the creator, I don't know where the creator is. It is here. It is here. They're everywhere.
Plato will never agree with you.
Huh?
Plato will never agree with you.
Well, Plato was wonderful among other old classical Greek. I think we need to move beyond that. Not that we know better, but we're all struggling to trying to find the way.
We want to be gods, you know.
This is very dangerous too, because if everyone would like to be goddess and God, then we have a big responsibility. And I missed your presence in my plenary session. We're talking about love, eros, which is, I call generator of desire, hence G-O-D, God for short. So I don't really separate humans from that, what we call the nominous, the divine, whatever people want to call it. I have no name for it. As Coptic Christian, probably my mother will slap me and say, it is Jesus Christ, son. Yes, mom. So maybe I want to just conclude with something here that's very important for me. Maybe that we don't really understand the phenomena that we call paradoxes.
Yep.
And we tend, not we here, but in general, there is a tendency to see paradoxes as problems that must be solved. Paradoxes will never be solved. And we tended to see paradoxes in dualistic way, which is unfair. So maybe ultimately that's what we're dealing with, and I don't know that for sure. I'm struggling with you, with everyone else. Maybe it's our inability to persevere paradoxes.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. But I will give me my reflection after your talk. Let us go to neuroscience again, back. Heart and brain. Ancient Egyptians were 100% right, because heart, that's new discovery, heart has 40,000 neurons. And information goes from the heart to the brain, not from the brain to the heart. That's new, 40,000 neurons here, 150 billion neurons here. Why you can drink whiskey and your brain still works? Because you are killing millions, but not billions of neurons. Expanding our understanding about the heart. Heart, this is very serious part of long-term, very scientific, very basic project of Princeton University. Princeton University placed very sensitive magnetometers for measurement of the Earth magnetic field. In many countries, we have one magnetometer in Lithuania. And these devices, they monitor what is happening with magnetic field, and they translating through satellites all that monitoring data every minute to Princeton University. They collect data, analyze data, and they are looking to correlations. If you will look what is happening with magnetic field of the Earth, you will find that our heart is synchronized by the Earth's magnetic field. I will not go deeper to this special science. This is for understanding, better understanding of cardiology and for better understanding of a holistic approach to the human organism. Concerning paradoxes, we have much less paradoxes in the 21st century comparing with previous centuries. Paradoxes trend is going down because of fundamental science, better understanding what is happening in our body. But brain is still important. Jesus, I will give you one example. When chess world champion Karpov was playing chess with the supercomputer in California, supercomputer, they were playing equally, but supercomputer consumed 150 kilowatts of energy, was hot. Kasparov consumed 20 watts, later than this one little bulb, you know. That means our computer in the brain is, Jesus, what a power, but we don't understand that. But in the future, who knows? Thank you.
I have two simple questions. At the beginning of your presentation, you referred to flair. And how do you relate flair to intuition?
Oh.
And then my second question is, in both cases you dealt with, you refer to contemplation before you find a solution. How do you organize your contemplation?
I am sorry. I will not go to this deeply to this field, because this field is much more psychological than philosophical. And if you will look to literature of psychology, they explain creativity by bipolar disorder. You know, I am maniac one day, I am depressed second day. Not me, but explanation is about paranoia and pathology. In psychology is the science with limits, and this limit of ability to explain intuition gives them possibility to go to psychiatry. That's my feeling, you know, but that's the feeling.
How do you organize? I mean, contemplation means time, and now we don't have time. So how do you organize and how do you find solutions?
Okay, this will be a very personal answer. I started to think much deeper about science. I started to spend time thinking and contemplating when and why. When Soviet Union collapsed, and my all funding agencies disappeared like this, and after 2 weeks of contemplation, I got funding from America. This was my motivation to contemplate, to spend time silently in some special place and to think how to get second funding. You know. I am funded perfectly now. Hunger.
Professor Ragauskas, thank you very much for your presentation. I feel a duty to add something from the point of view of a materialist, pragmatist, atheist, natural science friendly, empirically oriented, and Jane Addams epistemology eager scholar. So my comment is actually very much in support of your thesis. I think your idea of a call for humility in talking about creativity is very important. Creativity has been defined throughout history in many ways. The Greeks were mostly talking about mimesis and the idea that creativity is a form of imitation from nature. So that was equally humble. And I think the fact that you mentioned that creativity is mostly discovery, I think is a useful thing. My question, however, relates more or less to what we were saying, to how the discussion is proceeding, and somehow to what is the purpose of our project in Numanities, which is one of the reasons why we have the honor to have you here as a plenary speaker. That is, we are trying to understand, among other things, what is the communication breakdown between humanities and natural sciences. You came here to talk about things that most of us are unfamiliar with. And yet, when we think about the original project of humanism, the likes of you and the likes of us were one single person. I always like to remember Leonardo da Vinci. This year we have the Vitruvian Man as the logo of the Congress, so of course it's an appropriate question. Some time ago, a single person would have discussed the aspect that emerged in the discussion plus the aspect that you discussed that. So my question is, Where, when, how do you think this breakdown between natural sciences and humanities and a separation, such a neat separation of roles, occurred? What is your point of view? And as a natural scientist, what is your opinion on how humanities could contribute to the very important things that you are doing?
Oh, thank you, Professor. You asked about very, how to say, wide and deep things. And when and how and why, we need to focus. In our field of activity, in our field of work, we need to focus and we need to forget all disturbances. And when you are focusing, let us say, you are training your subconscious network of neurons to forget, if you are in technology, to forget humanities, to forget politics, to forget philosophy, to forget many things. But this way goes productively and effectively until some special point. After that, you need to be wider again, and this is like to be wide, to be narrow, to be wide, to be narrow, if you want to go deeper and deeper. And because of that, I am here. I have to be wide, in order to simply to go next step, That's my feeling, not very, how to say, scientific explanation.
One thing that I think did not come out was the number of students that you have undertaken to teach and the number of PhDs and their success. So I'd like to ask something else. How do you teach this flair for innovation?
First of all, my doctoral students, they're really talented, and I am working for quality, not for quantity. But we need 2 years, 2.5 for doctoral student to start act as independent contemplator. 2.5 years of personal conversation. And personal conversation, let us say, which happens 2 times in the week, is long enough, sometimes 2-3 hours, and this is what a terrible pressure on the brain of the student. He is tired after that. I am full of energy after that. That's really heavy work, for him, not for me. I like this work.
It's working? Okay. Thank you very much for your talk. I'm really interested about what is your process in creating and innovating, and you've been over 160 patents, and what does it take to have one patent, or what has been your own personal journey in creating and innovating and creating new patents, and what were all the obstacles you had? Well, not all of them. Well, just one example of obstacles, and what does it take to create and innovate and actually reach a patent?
You have to be my student, But very briefly talking about, let us say, beginning of this journey and adventure, of course, I had really great mentor. This guy was, his nationality, he was Jewish. Jesus, what a smart person. And he used the same method for me. He was talking to me, what is the meaning of this? What is the meaning of that? 2, 3, 4 hours. After that, I was exhausted every time. But he changed my mind. This was start. And he was inventor. Somehow he translated his methodology to my brain.
Thank you. We still have one more question. You comment. Okay. So your comment and your question. Okay.
I mean, the other obstacle that we have today is back in a couple of decades ago, it was one person inventing, and right now it's more of a collaborative invention.
This collaboration in this field is politics.
It's politics. I mean, I'm within the design field, and how I currently work, it's extremely collaborative, and I wanted to know that when you had the eye, that there's that inventor, and you have the assistants that would do all these crazy inventions for them, that they will have one breakthrough overall, going through massive amounts of quantity to reach one qualitative invention. But right now, with all the limitations and all the fund restrictions that you have, and you have to work in collaborative areas, how would you go about that? If, let's say, today you were 20 years old and you wanted to pursue, and your goal was to have 160 patents in the next 30 years, how would you take that?
Okay, a good start is to join the team of professionals. But many agencies in America, they were studying this process of creation of collective brain, collective mind, and they found, and that's easy to understand, that the main obstacle is language. And if you are connecting, let us use your approach. If we are connecting 7 creators, that's okay. But if we are connecting 8 creators, we will destroy this team. We have limit of the effectiveness in the team, and this limit is the consequence of our language, which is not for creation of the collective brain. That means join a small team, 3, 4, 5 professionals, and as I said, after 2 and 3 years, you will absolutely, without big, pressure on your brain, you will feel yourself a little bit better in creativity. You know that.
Thank you very much. That was really, really interesting. I've been trying to read Clayton Christensen's work about innovator's dilemma and innovator's prescription, where he tried to involve innovation theory in medicine. And if I understood it, he partly suggested that medicine's future should be decentralized. So instead of bringing people to the hospital, you simplify the devices, make them portable, and take them to the people, like the Aravind Eye Care in India. I was wondering, did you think this, he's right and this fits with what you're doing? And secondly, do you think this is a way to engage natural science with humanities if you're then taking the hospital to the people instead of the people to the hospital?
Oh, the general trend is decentralization and individualization of treatment. Even in extremely expensive place in medicine, in neuro-intensive care unit, we have experience. I am sitting in neuro-intensive care units hours and hours in different countries, and we have experiences that we can provide much better treatment, tailoring treatment for this particular person than using guidelines and general recommendations, etc., etc. In pharmacology, this is general trend. Using your gene analysis to understand your, disorder, and to adjust chemistry to work just for your body. That's individualization. You are absolutely right that this is the general trend, but can you think about the cost of this? Jesus. I will give you one example. If you have the person after car crash, in neurointensive care unit, 1 hour after car crash, a lot of things happen in the brain, in the body. At least three professionals have to sit, have to work around this person during all the night and to save his life 8, 9 times in order to stabilize in the morning. This is really costly work. I didn't expect this kind of discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. And to conclude, we have one more thing, an experiment, and maybe Sylvia will briefly introduce what it is about.
Yes, in these days I was drawing and painting in the same moment of the conference were going on. In this case, I can show, but the other are outside. Maybe it's very concrete, and it was something synchronically. And maybe the major idea that I got, it was the contemplation and the paysage in the middle of the picture. Remind us this idea to wait and to listen and to hear and to observe, in the same time creating it. There is maybe hidden the idea of poiesis more than mimesis, and there are some very important words that the professor said. And
thank you very much. I will change my approach to creativity.
Other thing, yeah, the idea of...
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our fifth day of ICON, final day. This is going to be our final plenary lecture, and I have the pleasure and the honor to moderate it and to invite Professor Teodoro Forte-Daghi from Harvard Medical School and Queen's University in Belfast. I would like actually to give a less formal introduction, because only to list the many achievements and skills of Professor Daghi is quite a hopeless task, because really he's such an accomplished man, and I'm sure from his bio note you can have a glimpse to that. But much more interesting from my point of view is how we actually met. And I want to share this story because it's one of the funniest. And I'm not the type, as you noticed this morning, I'm not the type of person who believes in destiny, but if I ever have some counter argument, this would be one of those. So we are sitting in an airplane from Vilnius to Frankfurt, and there is this gentleman sitting on my right, and so he's reading his newspaper. The waitress comes, and it turns out this gentleman is vegetarian, but no possibility of vegetarian dishes could be arranged in that plane. Then he asked for something else, and again it was a negative answer. And very calmly, but very firmly, he said like, okay, never mind, this is uncivilized. And continued to read his newspaper. I thought I had to offer my solidarity as a vegetarian. So I just went, excuse me, sir, I don't normally talk to people, which is true, by the way, another element of destiny. I don't normally talk to strangers in planes because I think, I don't want to disturb them, but I really understand you. And very calmly and firmly, he puts away his newspaper and starts listening to me. And we had this marvelous trip from Vilnius to Frankfurt, in which he was mostly listening, but somehow, which is one of his great skills, by the way. He's the best embodiment of the Chinese proverb that we have 2 ears and 1 mouth because we are supposed to listen twice as much as we talk. But despite the fact that he was mostly listening and I was mostly talking, I arrived in Frankfurt with a clear notion that I know nothing about the world and this man knows a lot. He knew Italian history far better than me. Whatever topic we would face, there would be always 80% of my nonsense talking and 20% of very interesting things that he would say. So a very Casablanca style friendship started after that, and I'm very pleased and honored to invite Professor Daghi to his lecture.
Well, as the philosopher says, there's probably some truth someplace in there, but there's not a whole lot of truth in it. But you're very kind anyway. Well, many of you would be surprised to find that there's a physician, a neurosurgeon, talking to you about semiotics. So am I. What I'd like to discuss, however, is a topic which is, I think, very interesting because semiotics actually starts with medicine, even though most people don't remember that. And what I'd like to talk about is concussion. I'm going to call this disability, diversity, and accommodation the curious case of concussion. Because to look at the history and the intellectual development of this idea of semiotics generally, you would not think that it actually started the way it does. We have a big agenda. I'll try to talk about these, but I want to talk about semiotics in science and medicine. I want to talk about signs in medicine. What is concussion? I want to talk about semiotics in two ways, the semiotics of and the semiotics after head injury. They're two different things. I want to talk about student athletes. That's one of my passions. They're both heroes and victims. They're victims of concussion, why and what happens. There's certain ethical issues, part of the greater agenda of this conference, which are very, very important. I'll talk about the history of concussion a little bit later because we need to put a mise en scène. We need to put this into place, and then the history makes sense. What we've learned, concussion, a semiotic framework, and then the conclusions. So let me start by talking about semiotics. Can everybody hear me? Good. If I'm not clear, if I'm not making sense, stop me at any time. So the term semiotics, even though it's a much older term, was introduced in English in 1670 by Henry Stubbs. Stubbs is very often confused with John Locke, who was a physician, and the quotation that says, what semiotics is about is often attributed to Stubbs mistakenly. It was actually John Locke who spoke about three things in knowledge. One is the nature of things as they are in themselves, their relationships and their manner of operation. One is that which man himself ought to do as a rational and voluntary agent for the attainment of any end, especially happiness. And the third is the ways and means by which the knowledge of both the one and the other of these is attained and then communicated. And that he called semiotiké, the doctrine of signs. And this is the quotation. It's in Old English. Nor is there anything to be relied upon in physic. Physic was the theory of medicine. There is still a professor of physics at Oxford and a professor of physics at Harvard. But an exact knowledge of medicinal physiology founded on observation, not on principles, so he was an empiricist. And he called that semiotics, a method of curing and tried. The word excogitated is no longer used in English, but it means contrived or something that is invented. And it's of curing and tried medicines. And so by convention, medicine was divided into symptoms and signs. Symptoms were a phenomenon caused by a disease or a condition. If you sneeze, that's a symptom. It's directly observable and directly by experience. It's a manifestation, a direct manifestation of illness. The symptom is transformed into a sign by the inference. So somebody comes to me and they have a rash. If the rash is on a hand, especially if it's on the palm of the hand, I worry about syphilis. If it's on the face, I worry about measles. Same rash, different location, different disease. Signs point beyond themselves. If all I do is call it a small rash, I haven't done anything. They can either turn to a present illness or a past illness or to some kind of future event. That becomes part of its meaning. We are informed about the patient or the disease, and this issue that any sign in medicine must convey meaning is the critical element I want to leave you with. In medicine, there are 4 types of signs, 4 categories. A prognostic sign indicates the outcomes of a patient. If I see that somebody is in shock, they've had a heart attack, they're dehydrated, they're more than 80 years old, I can tell you that the prognosis is very bad, no matter what you do. If I make a diagnosis of a certain kind of brain tumor, today I would add a genomic piece to that, the gene signature, I can tell you how long that patient will live, irrespective of what I do. There's something which Hippocrates describes called the facies hippocratica, in which you look at somebody's face and you say that person is about to die. Very important, because in ancient medicine, if you were a surgeon and you operated on somebody who was about to die, that was considered hubris or arrogance, and you were considered a bad doctor. The next kind of sign is called an anamnestic sign. Anamnestic, from able to recall. It indicates the past existence of a disease or condition. When Freud talked about the ways in which you think about people and disease, can I move around a little bit? Can you hear me? Okay. When Freud talked about disease and people, he said, what you want to do is to get people to have their own anamnesis, so they remember what happened to them, and that's how they understand their own disease. Then you have, diagnosis. Diagnosis is the ability to distinguish one thing from another. When you debug a computer, you're talking about the diagnosis of the computer. If you're tuning an instrument and you say one instrument is off, or you're saying the middle C is British and not Italian, you're making a diagnosis. Pathognomosis is something else. It's a sign pointing categorically to a certain disease. So I know if a child is born like this and walks around like this, that's called an Erb's palsy. And it occurs because when the child is delivered, there's a pull on the nerves in the arm, on the brachial plexus. It's pathognomonic. There's no question of what it is. I may not know the molecular structure, but I know something else. So there's a very interesting overlap between 2 ideas in science. One is signs, and the other is the epistemology. So everybody knows what an umpire is. An umpire is somebody who calls fair or foul in a sport. So this is an umpire in tennis, and somebody's very angry at him. And so we say that there were 2 young umpires and an older umpire, and the 2 young umpires wanted very much to impress the older umpire because they wanted his job. So the first young one said, talking about fair and foul, he said, I call them, I name them as I see them. Okay? And then the second one said, no, you're wrong. I call them as they are. And the older umpire laughed and said, you're both crazy. They are what I call them. And that's the brief history of epistemology. But there's also something in semiotics in which, if you're talking about distinguishing one thing from another, are they what you call them, or do you call them what they are? And that balance is part of what I want to talk about today. So today I want to talk about concussion, which is a neurological phenomenon that follows traumatic injury to the head and to the brain. It has to be traumatic. It's not a stroke. It's not internal. It's not a hemorrhage. In fact, it results from an impact of the head and by implication to the brain. Traditionally, loss of consciousness, how long somebody is unconscious, defines the severity. More than 15 minutes, severe. More than 5 minutes, moderate. Less than 5 minutes, mild. It turns out that's wrong, but it's still taught. And it's still very important in the military, because rules for pilots are that if you have unconsciousness more than 15 minutes, you never go back to flying. If you're between 5 minutes and 15 minutes, then you can fly after a year. If you're less than 5 minutes, you can fly as soon as a surgeon says that you can fly. Again, that's wrong for reasons that we're going to talk about, but it's important because that's the way the sign is interpreted. What is it traditionally? Loss of consciousness, amnesia, so you forget, mostly retrograde. You forget what happens before. An addled brain. Oh, Dorone, are you here because you were going to translate addled for me? It's not a word that people know. It doesn't exist. Okay, it's to be confused. In German, it's zerstreutet. Somebody whose brain simply doesn't work. There are no focal neurological signs. I do a neurological examination, there's nothing wrong. We used to say that if you have somebody who can close their eye, hop on one leg, hop on the other leg, and have their arms outstretched, the brain is fine. Mine may be, it may not be, but for the most part, the brain is fine. And more importantly, there's no anatomical abnormality, not on pathology and not on imaging. It's a huge problem. In the United States, there are 3.8 million per year, so almost as many as there are Lithuanians in Lithuania. There are 5 to 10 chances per playing season that a student athlete in high school or university will have a concussion. There are 3 million children in the United States who get concussions every year. 80 to 90% of them are mild, but that means 300 to 500,000 severe concussions. And to what does it actually signify? Well, there are 4 components to it. There's a cognitive component, and the cognitive component is what people call executive functions. It's the ability to think and to process, to use logic, imagination, humor, poetry. One of my colleagues was in medical school and was a poet, and was a very, very fine scientist along the line that Professor Ragauskas talked about earlier today. He had a flair. He had a concussion playing European football. Poetry was gone. Also what was gone was the ability to do innovative research. He could follow a protocol, but he couldn't create it. It was just gone. Physical, double vision, incoordination, inability to stand, fatigue. Emotional, depression, inability to imagine things, feelings of despondency. Sleep disorders, nightmares, inability to wake up sometimes, inability to fall asleep. The proximate cause, the immediate cause, is injury and impact. And it may occur whenever the head strikes an object or is struck by an object. There's no penetration. They produce unconsciousness or bleeding in or around the brain, and the bleeding may be microscopic. You may never see it. The brain is surrounded by a very, very tough layer called the dura. The dura is attached to the brain, and what happens is that the brain bounces around in the skull and against the dura, causing swelling on a microscopic basis. And it affects eye movement, so there's double vision. It affects breathing, speech, and balance. They're most often caused by blows to the head, but they don't have to. A very famous professor of neurosurgery wrote his own account of his own concussion when he came out of a taxi in Paris, bumped his head, knew something had happened, couldn't figure out what, and that was the point. He arrived, he went to the airport, then it was Le Bourget, came to the airport, came to the United States, went to the hospital and said something is wrong. And it was, but he couldn't figure out what. So the brain bounces back and forth, the normal chemical balance of the brain is disrupted, the brain swells. And here you see the 3 classical grades of concussion. Let's see, do we have a laser here? No. Okay. If you see here, grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, we no longer use that, but that is very much the classic use of the term. And the way it occurs, is there? There we go, thank you. Great, okay. So these 3 are the guidelines that people use, but they're wrong, and subsequently they've been abandoned for reasons that I'll tell you about. And again, how does it occur? It occurs when brain is injured by pressure, but there's something very, very important, which is the more modern idea, which is the second impact syndrome. The second impact syndrome works like this. I had a patient once who was taking out the garbage on a windy day, and the garbage bin was made out of plastic. You know what a plastic garbage bin looks like? It's very light, and the lid is very, very light. But the wind raised the lid, it fell on his head, and he was knocked out for a week. How did that happen and why? It turns out that during World War II he was a pilot, he ejected from his airplane, he landed safely, he was knocked out, And some 35 or 40 years later, this was the second injury. And a very simple, light second injury brought back all the elements of the first. One of the elements of concussion is that concussion itself is a prognostic sign. You learn that if you have a concussion, the next blow can be de minimis. It can be very, very light, and you still have a very, very severe effect. So commonly reported symptoms are these that we talked about: headache, dizziness, nausea, vomiting, with cognitive symptoms of confusion, depression, moodiness. And then there are things you look for. These are the signs: vomiting, poor coordination, repeated loss of consciousness, personality changes. The eyes look funny, there's sensitivity to light, a whole number of things, including slowness. And you can look at it in two ways. You can look at it as a list like this, which is illogical. It's the way you would expect to see it in a textbook. Or you can look at it like this. This is the descriptive language of concussion signs and symptoms. Remember, we distinguished between signs and symptoms. But the person who has concussion and the people who live with somebody who has a concussion can't distinguish it. Because everything that you tell me you have may or may not correspond exactly to what I see, and everything that I see, the signs that I see, may not correspond exactly to what you have. But when you look at this system of what's wrong, this combination is the combination of the signs and the symptoms, which is actually a collapse of what signifies and the signifiers. You can also speak of it in terms of a social context, in terms of a social semiotic context. This is a syndrome that occurs after a concussion. What happens to the person, not to the brain? What happens to the person in a social context? So we talk about deficits or disability. Some are chronic, some are permanent. We talk about headaches, stress, what happens to children, symptoms of anxiety, the sports that you can no longer do. What if you're a player? What happens if you're a football player? What happens if you're fatigued? What happens if you're a professional in the middle of writing a paper and you find that you cannot? How do we think about this? What language do we use? And while we're talking about that, the medical distinctions between signs and symptoms. So thinking and remembering, is that a sign or is that a symptom? The physical pieces, we generally call them signs because we attribute them to individual patients. But patients know them as well. The same with the mood, the same with the sleep. And we generally think of them in terms of neuroprocessing and the brainstem. This is what seeing double looks like. I cannot see when you see double. You tell me that you see double. Sometimes I can prove it because the eyes don't move together. But even if I can't see it, what you describe to me tells me, if I listen carefully to you, a tremendous amount about what's going on in the brain. This does not happen in normal people. We are able to take two images and the brain can put them together. If somebody loses some vision in one eye, they can still put it together. Some older people like to have a contact lens in one eye, which lets them see far, and a contact lens in the other eye, which lets them see close. That way they don't need glasses for reading. The ability of the brain to do that is a very, very complicated and sophisticated ability. Most people learn it in half an hour. It's not hard, but you can lose it. So the conventional management of concussion, which is not really what I want to talk about, but I'll just mention it, involves period of rest that's sport-specific, gradual rehabilitation, and then you do more and more until confidence is restored and you can coach somebody back to playing a normal sport or back to their normal life. But let's say you have a teacher who's teaching third grade, where the children are very difficult. Second and third grade is very, very difficult emotionally for a student because the children do not listen. And that teacher had a concussion. Can she or he go back to teaching second or third grade as readily as somebody who's teaching geography in high school can go back to teaching? And the answer is no, because the emotional needs, the emotional demands are very, very different. Somebody who's a psychoanalyst is different from somebody who is an orthopedic surgeon or a physical therapist. The demands of the profession are different, and we have no language by which to describe that. I think that's a very important lapse. So on the one hand, this lecture is about the greater significance of concussion, and I want to talk about our understanding of fundamental changes that occur in memory and neural processing and language. At the same time, this gives us an opportunity to explore the meanings that we attribute to changes in language and changes in prosody. Does everybody know the use of the word prosody in language and physiology? Is that a no? Good. Thank you for answering. So prosody is the melody with which we speak. If I say to you two things in exactly the same way, one is, hello, I'm glad to see you. The other is, hello, I'm glad to see you. I'm saying very different things. The words are the same, but the melody is very, very different. If I say to you, come here, that's different than come here. But the words are the same. How do we express that? And what happens when somebody no longer can differentiate between the two? We call them rude, but it's more than rudeness. It may be the inability to control. So at the same time, we have an opportunity to explore meanings that we attribute to language and to prosody and the words that we use. There's certain things that happen in some languages that don't happen in other languages. In French or German, the difference between du and sie, or tu and voi, or tu and vous, those differences are very, very important in certain languages, and if you lose them, you lose the ability to have a social conversation. Those are the kinds of things that are lost after concussion. In that sense, this relates not only to the semiotics of the concussion, but the metasemiotics of change when language is no longer used the way it was before in language and the head injured. So we're talking about the naming of brain injury. What is a concussion is what is not. Our understanding of what happens with brain injury, the language use after brain injury, and the way we view the individual with brain injury. During the Second World War, there was a very famous neurologist who was a member of the underground in Norway. His name is Monrad Krohn. And for those of you interested in language, it's worth reading what he talks about. He talks about people who have very strange changes. A woman, he was called to see a woman who was about to be shot by the underground because she was found speaking Norwegian with a German accent. It was a perfect German accent, but this woman came from a farm. She had never been to Germany. She never spoke German. She had had a stroke, and it affected the way she used language and the prosody. He was asked to see another man who was about to be shot by the Nazis. He was about to be shot because his job was to choose colors and to name them for camouflage. He too had a stroke, and he lost the ability to distinguish among colors and to name them correctly. So what had been a Feldgrau, a field gray of the German uniform, he called something else. And he was accused of sabotage. But his friends said, he just looks sick. Those are the kinds of things that we see. Let's also talk for a second about semiotics after head injury. So Saussure talks about the difference between langue and parole. Actually, you have a shift in concussion. It's either a collapse or a shift, and the meaning of each actually takes some piece of the other. We find alterations in the structures and rules of semiotic systems. So I may turn to you and I say, I see, you're carrying a clock. Saying that's not a clock, it's a watch. He says there's no difference. A clock tells time and a watch tells time. I'm using a word not to name. I'm using a word to signify. Well, what do you call that in the garden? You know, the thing that tells time by the sun? Oh, that's a watch. Well, could it be a sundial? Yeah, a watch is a sundial. Well, a watch is not a sundial is not a watch, neither is a clock. But if you lose that distinctive piece in language, you may not be able to find exactly the parallelisms of these different forms of words. So a way of thinking of that is to say new signs are created, and the signs are ambiguous. Instead of using language to disambiguate, we reambiguate the way many children will reambiguate. And we are witness to the creation of new forms of signified entities. Some of them are semiotic things, and some of them are medical things. So here are the implications. One implication is, since we're looking at change in the use of language and words, and we're looking at it over time, I think technically it's fair to say we're looking at a diachronic rather than a simply synchronic analysis of signs. We are also invited to look at a diachronic analysis of language of and during and after injury. I want to know, I want to listen to what you say. I want to hear how you say it. One of the ways in which I learn whether or not you're recovering is the way in which you use language, because language is actually very, very complex. So if you use synonyms or make puns, you have a different use of language than if you're very concrete. If I ask you, what is this floor? And you say the floor is on. Or I ask you, what is this floor? And you say this floor is made of pieces of wood. Both answers are correct, but they're different. Aristotle says what human beings can do, part of humanity, is the ability to hold contradictions in one mind simultaneously. Well, the other side of that that's not emphasized is the ability to hold parallelisms. If you speak to Professor Ragauskas, he'll tell you that some experiments you don't know until you do them whether or not they'll work. So there are two possibilities. They may work or they may not work. That is actually a very sophisticated statement, and it requires you to go in different directions. After concussion, you cannot do that. It may also mean you don't know whether to go home, you turn left, or you turn right, because that requires a sense of directionality that you don't have. When semiotics after head injury are seen as a structured whole rather than bits of meaning, you have new understandings not only of manifest meaning, but also of latent meaning. And that's why I think this is such an interesting topic that requires further study, the latent and the manifest in language and communication. Well, are we going then to an extension of Bakhtin's and Volozhinov's critique of Saussure, that he was too synchronic? I think that's a fast question to ask. We can also ask questions about the disability that is behind this. Is this a language shift? And if it is a language shift, is it a disability? If I look at a camera and I say a camera is an eye, is that a trope? Is it a metaphor? Or is it an error in language? How does the perception of disability result in disability? If I say to you, you cannot hit a tennis ball, does that change the way you feel about yourself? How about if you hit it perfectly, 20 times? And I say, I don't care how many times you hit it, the next time will be bad. What does that do to you? Is the perception of disability, in fact, a reality? If I turn to two students of music, and I give them both a simple piece, Fürelise, and I say, play it. They both play it exactly the same way. And I say to one, that's brilliant, you should play Chopin. And I say to the other, that's terrible. You can't even play, you can't even play an exercise, Hannah. What does that mean? What are you actually doing? And what are the signs of the disability, and what does it consist of? Is it your own perception of self, or is it the inability to do something? Sometimes when you talk, when you test language in somebody, you take the watch. You always take the watch. And you say, what is this called? So this is called a strap. If somebody says a belt, it's the wrong word. What is this called? Well, this has many words. Most people don't know what it is. They'll call it a buckle. Fair enough. You say, what are these? And some people will say it's hands. And some people will say, no, it's what points to the hour, which is what you say in German, something that points to an hour. Well, that's not English. And if you have somebody who's an English speaker and that's the only thing they say, then you say they don't have words. They have word-finding difficulty. But the metaphor elicits a different kind of use of language in which I do something called circumlocution. I talk about something around a sign because I don't have the name of the sign. Is it a metaphor? Is it creative? Is it something that I try to do in order to work around a disability? How do I respond to that? If I ask somebody, what color is this? And they say, oh, it's navy blue. And I look at it and I say, well, it's not exactly navy blue. It's another color. And they say, well, no, I think it's navy blue. Do you say you see differently than I do? That's possible. People have different color temperature in each eye. Quite possible. Or do I say you're wrong? That blue has a name, and we need to reteach you what the name is. What about ethically? Student tries to go back to playing basketball after a concussion. You know, people play basketball. Most kids of high school age play basketball, and they get the ball more or less in the basket much of the time. This child no longer can. What do I say? Do I say you're doing fine? Do I say you're doing fine after a concussion? Do I say, sit down for a while, you can't play? Do I say, play anyway and get back into it? Do I say, you're perfect? You have the same question in a different sense in terms of teaching art to children in, say, 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade. Two different approaches. The traditional Russian approach was everybody has to learn how to copy the masters, and then you do your own art form. The American form is everybody's a genius. Whatever scribble you put on paper is brilliant. Each has advantages and disadvantages. One believes in standards, one doesn't. What do you do with language? How do you work it? And then the most important thing is the disability that we see an invitation to view the world differently. And here I'm just going to make a very, very brief comment. Is everybody familiar with the many books that have come out by schizophrenics, or the art of people like Munch or Van Gogh, which is really an expression of either schizophrenia, or in Van Gogh's case, it's not entirely clear, it may have been an expression of too much digitalis, a heart medication, a poisoning. And I can show you schizophrenic art, I can show you the good, the bad, the beautiful, and the ugly, but the colors and the shapes are very, very similar. They're very, very clearly similar. I can show you other Charles Munches. They're not as good, but you'll recognize it's as though somebody not talented tried to copy it. I can show you poetry by schizophrenics, and there's a certain pattern to it. Is that a function of the brain? Is that a function of the individual? How do we deal with it, especially if it's beautiful? How do you deal with a Van Gogh? Do you say, this is magnificent, I want you, if you want to be a painter, go learn to paint from Van Gogh. But he's painting differently than a Rembrandt. Whom should you study from? There's still broader implications. The evolution of our understanding of concussion is actually a study in the evolution of signs and their meaning in medicine. Because 15 years ago, nobody would have said that you could have concussion without loss of consciousness. Today, we say you do. Then we would have said, the danger is the first blow. Today we say we don't care about the first blow. It's the first, the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth. And the football players who commit suicide because they become depressed, and then they sue the teams, the family sues the team, it's because of many repetitive blows to the head, and we never understood before just how serious that was. And that brings up the issue in the United States of whether 7-year-old boys should play football. I would never let my child play football. I think it's too dangerous. There's a political joke. Some of you know that I collect political humor. When President Ford took over from President Nixon, he was not the most enlightened president in the world, and people said, he played football too many times without a helmet. So that's in the folk humor what happens to football players. Football players all end up buying into McDonald's food franchises when they retire because they have money, but there's nothing else they can do. Why? This evolution also leads to an exploration of the meaning of signs in and as a result of altered functioning of the brain. Here we're talking about injury, but it can be something else. And it also brings us to a re-examination in general of meaning. So, what is the meaning of intellectual and personality changes that young athletes undergo after concussion, and what is the greater meaning of measurable and definable changes in brain function without changes in brain anatomy. With that, let me take a quick 1-second break and ask, is everything that I'm talking about clear? Am I speaking too quickly, or are you following me all right? Good. Okay. So here's the mise en scène. Most student athletes are seen as heroes. Greatest way to get a boy or a girlfriend is to be an athlete, or to be a cheerleader, or to go around student athletes. They're surrogate heroes. What happens to student athletes when they no longer play? Do they become villains, anti-heroes? I've seen that happen. I've seen coaches turn to students after a concussion and say, "You're a coward. You're afraid. You're a weakling." How should they be protected? Head-injured athletes are often labeled. He was an athlete who can no longer play. Concussed athletes previously were not labeled as particularly good or bad. They were just student athletes. But afterwards, they're labeled. Now, look at it in two ways. On the one hand, the labeling is very good because it protects the athlete from playing when they could be injured. On the other hand, it's very bad because their value as human beings is in a certain sense depreciated. How do we think about this anger and depression and the loss of judgment, the emotional changes that people undergo when they are labeled and when they have concussion? The term that's used in the United States is that people sometimes learn differently. So I know, for example, that there are certain things that I cannot do as well as other people. I cannot solve equations in my brain. I have many friends who can. I can't do it. When I have an equation that I have to solve, I have to write it down. I learn mathematics differently than people who are really geniuses and really good at it. I just can't do it. But there are other things that I can do. I have a three-dimensional sense. I have languages. What responsibilities do we have as scientists, social scientists, educators, to students who are injured, given what we're now learning about the consequences of injury? How do we protect the injuries, the children? So from that, I want to go a little bit through the history of concussion to tell you, just for fun, how people have thought about it. The Greeks mention it, and they call it commotio cerebri, movement of the brain, and you see it in Hippocrates about 2,500 years ago. It's the idea of shaking of the brain, and that was the understanding through the 19th century. This is a bust of Hippocrates, maybe we take it as the bust, and this is a copy of the Hippocratic corpus from the 11th century, and this is the way it was often printed out. In the 10th century in Persia, it was described and characterized as transient loss of function without physical damage, different than an arrow or a sword to the head. This is just a blow to the head. And it's arguably established as the paradigm of concussion. By 13th century in Europe, you have an entire set of schools of medicine. This is after the establishment of the school in Bologna. This is after the school in Montpellier, after the school in Paris. L'Enfant of Milan has a book called Chirurgia Magna, and he discusses concussion again as motion of the brain. But here's what he does. He talks about the difference between concussion and traumatic brain injury, and he says transient post-concussion syndrome, which he recognizes for the first time, is temporary loss of function from the injury. This is limited empiricism. It's not scholastic. There's nothing previous to compare it to. But it's important not to read this anachronistically. Don't read this when you see it as, oh, he's thinking in modern times. And this is his Chirurgia Magna, and that's what we know as the picture of L'Enfant. The 14th century, we begin to see some early empirical surgery, and one of the most important figures is Guy de Chauliac in Montpellier and in Paris. And he says, I'm going to talk about prognosis. Don't operate on head injury if it's concussion, because there's relatively good prognosis as opposed to skull fractures or penetrating trauma. Here's the classic French Academy picture of Guy de Chauliac and his book La Grande Chirurgie. By the 16th century, we begin to talk about names and symptoms and causation. Ambroise Paré was not a physician. He was a barber surgeon. He was not trained academically. And he used the word commotion, just as others had, but here he's talking about shaking not of the head, but of the brain. For the first time, he attributes the problem to the brain and not the head. Concussion is used in the 16th century, and the same symptoms are described. And here is his book, Sur la tête, and the classic picture of Paré. And the interesting thing about Paré is that he's really the first empiricist and the first physician or barber surgeon to have a patient focus. By the 17th century, we have a mechanistic revolution, and we have a physical and structural mechanism or description. The prevailing view in the 17th century separates injury from physical damage and says the cause is not always reflected in the organ. This view continues through the 18th century, and concussion is used to speak of a state of unconsciousness as opposed to other functional problems. By the 19th century, Guillaume Dupuytren, a very well-known French surgeon in the post-Napoleonic era, begins to say, look, I have a microscope. I will differentiate not according to symptoms. I will no longer use prognostic and diagnostic signs. I will restrict myself to the physical signs that I actually see looking at the brain. So what I have is injury to the parenchyma or the substance of the brain, and then I will talk about injuries where the brain is not affected. And he says the difference between unconsciousness from the damage to the brain substance or parenchyma and the damage from concussion without such injury is where I'm going to focus my work. And he starts thinking about these things 200 years ago. This is Dupuytren, and for those of you who are literary semioticists, I just want to give you a picture of James Joyce and Sylvia Beach on Rue de Dupuytren, 1921 in Paris, just for the fun of it. 1941, we have the classical study on concussion. It was done at Oxford by Denny Brown and Russell. They did animal experiments, and they showed that you don't need to have damage to the brain in order to have a concussion. And that sort of closed the chapter on concussion until about 10 years ago. And the reason that it closed between 1941 and about 2000 to 2005, was because we didn't really know what to ask. By 2005, it was clear that the semiotics of brain injury had changed. It was now a social event. This is a book by a football player who played again and again in a brain-injured state and is now capable of functioning but at a much reduced level than he was before. The football groups are called leagues in the United States. This was called the League of Denial, about the football unions denying the fact that the football players were injured. And you see what happens in American football. I'm just going to go through a bunch of slides to show you what actually happens in sports. This is football. In ice hockey, this is a patient who now has Parkinson's disease because of injuries while playing hockey. A baseball is thrown at more than 140 kilometers an hour. If you're going to play in the major league, you have to be able to exceed 120 kilometers an hour with a football before you qualify to pitch. Baseball also has other kinds of hazards, and this is done very aggressively and very purposely. Rugby, we all know, is a very gentle sport, right? It's considered more gentle than baseball, and yet it's completely unprotected. There's no helmet. Look at what actually happens to the people who are playing. I don't know quite how well you can see it, but this is a neck injury and a head injury waiting to happen. Boxing was seen as the idealized gentleman's sport in the 19th century. In the United States Military Academy, which is a gentleman's academy, every cadet has to learn to box. What happens? It was considered heroics. Here you have the heavyweight championship of 1831 in England. Somebody from the Caribbean, a black versus a white from England. It was more than just a sport. It was a gladiatorial combat in which the implications of the sport itself was a sign of something else going on. And this is the reality. The reality is that boxing is a sport in which you try to create a concussion. That's the way in which you win. And the more major the concussion, the better off you are. But if somebody dies, you could be actually brought to trial. And other martial arts are just as bad. Here was the Tour de France in 2012. There was a terrible crash, multiple concussions, and I think there was one death from a head injury. Lacrosse is a very dangerous sport. If you want a scholarship to college in America, there are two things you do, or three things. You fence, you row, or you play lacrosse. There's money available for lacrosse. Look at what happens with the stick. Now, men are allowed to wear helmets, but women are not. Women's lacrosse is not allowed to use a helmet. That turns out to be very important. Women riders have a very high incidence of concussion and head injury, and most of the Olympic dressage riders are actually female. European football is said to be safer than American football, but if you look at the women who are most injured out of football, it is women, and women are injured most in horseback riding, football, and lacrosse. What do we know about women in sports? About gender, conditioning sports? Why the differences? We do know that the female athletes suffer a lot more head injuries than men do, in addition to other kinds of injuries. What does that actually mean? If we think of a post-concussive deficit or disability systems approach, we begin to think almost in computer senses of the judgment, the memory, the use of language, implicit and explicit memory. And when people talk about the difference between genders, men and women thinking, and the logic, the gender-based logic, you talk about women having more of an implicit sense of memory, language, creativity, men being more logical, and therefore thinking differently. But what you find after injury is that the two collapse. So not only do you have the loss of functions that we've talked about, but the particular type of creativity that exists in females as a gender tends to be more vulnerable after concussion to the type of creativity that you have in males. In males, what you tend to see is a drop in IQ. In females, you tend to see a change in creativity. Completely unstudied, but something that's very, very important. We also have a problem with the heroics of an injury. Football players who are earning a few $1,000s a day, say $10,000, $20,000 a day, don't want to be told they can't play. If they don't play, they don't get paid. So they try to hide the concussion. And then they're very angry because they're told to go back and play. They're called cowards if they don't. But if they're injured a second time in a season or a third time in a season, that can reduce their ability to drive, their emotional state, their ability to keep up with their children, many, many things. And this is from PBS, the public broadcasting system in the United States, and it's called Tough Calls. There was an attempt to get children, particularly on teams, to report on other children who had injuries. And that way, the coach would know who was really injured and who was not in an attempt to protect the children. There are new rules that were developed, sort of a social semiotic effect, and it's called the 2010-2011 National Football League Rulebook Changes on Concussion, and it says, any athlete who exhibits signs, symptoms, or behaviors consistent with a concussion shall be immediately removed from the contest or sport and not returned to play until cleared by an appropriate healthcare professional, and so forth. This was very much opposed by parents who thought that this would cheat their children out of an opportunity to have a scholarship to go to university, and by the children who didn't want to be labeled weak and coward and disabled. So there are very, very specific caveats, implications, and consequences. Boxing is intended to induce concussion. Concussion is an acceptable, damaging collateral consequence of other sports as well. But once the victim actually has a concussion, he's considered a loser. He changes from hero to non-hero. And the victim is actually transformed into an anti-hero, which is of course worse than being a non-hero. So think about this, if you will, in a semiotic framework, a synopsis and a focus. What is the meaning of the intellectual and personality changes that young athletes undergo after concussion? It shows that they've been hurt. It doesn't show necessarily that they're disabled, but from a prognostic perspective, it shows that they're extremely vulnerable to the next injury. What is the greater meaning? What are the greater implications of measurable and definable changes in brain function without changes in brain anatomy? The fact that the sign is ambiguous doesn't mean that there is not an underlying problem. The fact that I can't discern it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. There is a dichotomy between what is going on and what I see is going on, between that which is signified and the signifier, which means that I as a scientist have to look harder to be able to find the appropriate sign to determine what is going wrong and when it is going wrong. And there are two things I don't want to do. I don't want to label a child or a student someone who is disabled and injured when he's not. On the other hand, I don't want to expose a student athlete to additional injury, which could really make them disabled from many, many things when they're vulnerable. So both medicine and literature are classic signifying systems. Inherent to both medicine and literature, you have a fundamental ambiguity. There's a semiotic strategy of interpretation of symptoms. Maybe you'll disagree with me. Maybe it should be signs and not symptoms. There's an urge to a narrative. I want to tell you about my patient. I don't want to point at a name. There's a mythology. I will know what will happen with the patient. Because, prognosis now, maybe we're pretty good with it, but prognosis 100 years ago or 200 years ago, there was something to it, but there was also a lot of mythology. There's a creation of categories. The weak and the strong, the able, the disabled, the healthy, the ill, the vulnerable, the strong. And it's through performative acts of speech and communication. When I say to somebody, this child had a concussion, I'm communicating an event, and I'm actually communicating a very, very clear lexical context that anybody who knows what concussion is, you will know what it is. If you now see that somebody's gotten a concussion, you know exactly what it is. And it means a lot to you irrespective of the details. So the study of semiotics, and maybe it's the study of literature in medicine, affords the opportunity for us to comment not only on the medicine, not only on the illness, but also on the means of signification itself. And that's why I'm here, and that's why I thought this was such a fascinating topic. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very, very much for this wonderful presentation. I'm sure we have plenty of questions for Professor Daghi. Just to alleviate the tension, can we go back to slide number 19? Yeah, that's what I thought. So these are exactly the same symptom of a condition known as DDD, doctoral dissertation disease. When you look at them, difficulty thinking clearly, feeling slowed down, difficulty concentrating, difficulty remembering new information. These are all about implementing the PhD thesis. Anyway, sorry. Any question? Okay, John, then Aline. Okay, John Rowe from Medical School in Exeter University.
Do you think there's possibility to inform therapy by a greater application of psychosomatic medicine? That's partly what I was thinking about from the talk.
So maybe, can I ask you, let me ask you to open that up, unpack that just a little bit. What do you mean?
I was thinking about when you were talking about the how you deal with the active treatment of the sports conditions and and the psychology of it. And it made me think that the explanation itself, through using the medical semiotic framework, actually lends itself to a system of treatment post the event. I'm just wondering if you...
So, yes, that's a very, very important question. I'm going to divide the question into two parts. There's an emotional part, a psychological part, and there's a physical part. If somebody, after injury to the brainstem, has double vision, that's not something I can treat psychosomatically. That's something that will heal, or it needs to be treated in some way. The same thing if somebody has a fracture of the inner ear and needs to relearn balance. That's a very, very different story. But what you do have is depression. And depression has four components to it. There's sadness, there's loss of self-worth, there's anger, and there's a feeling of abandonment. Those are the four categorical elements. When you have those four categorical elements, you need to start someplace in the circle. I don't care where. And you have to ride around the circle if you're going to help the individual. And that's where that kind of psychosomatic medicine actually makes a huge difference. The last thing to recover is the sense of self-worth, interestingly enough. But that's exactly what you do.
Thank you. Then we have Alin Oltiano from Roehampton University.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. I have many things running through my mind right now. There is something puzzling me, which I would like to refer to. Towards the end of your talk, you mentioned the possible situation where a doctor might recognize a sign which does not coincide with the patient's significative world. Where I'm going here, you mentioned the dichotomy between a sign being seen and a sign actually manifesting in the patient.
Great question.
I'm sorry?
That's a great question.
Thank you. And if I can...
So,
sorry.
If there were a neurologist here rather than a neurosurgeon, the neurologist would be making fun of me, would be laughing at me. Because neurologists consider neurosurgeons to be defective. And they think that neurosurgeons don't know how to think, and the only thing they know how to do is to operate. So it turns out that a tumor here and a tumor here have almost the same effect on the brain. And in the old days, particularly in Great Britain, the neurologist would come into the operating theater and would say to the neurosurgeon where to operate. The neurosurgeon would draw the line and then do the operation. There's a story of the London hospital in which a very famous neurosurgeon decided that he was going to ignore the neurologist and just did the operation. The neurologist went in and the operation was done in the wrong place, whatever it was. I think it was done here instead of here. And the neurosurgeon turned to the neurologist and said, well, I should give up being a neurologist. And the neurologist said, no, you should learn how to be a neurologist so you could do it right. And the problem is that the brain is very ambiguous. The symptoms and signs in the nervous system are very ambiguous relative to the possible causes of those symptoms and signs. So the metaphor is, think of a telegraph line. If there's a telegraph line between Vilnius and Kaunas, and I cut the line, unless the line is self-reporting and it tells me where I have the break, all I know is that I can't go from one to the other. I don't know where the break is. If there are interim stations, I might be able to get to the point where I can tell you more or less where it is. But unless I see the point of the fracture, I can't see it. I don't know where it is. The brain is very, very similar. So one sign can be accompanied by many symptoms. One symptom, like unconsciousness, can have no signs or many signs. It depends on the cause. So the difference between the system, the semiotic system that we call the nervous system, and the semiotic system that exists in, say, literature or music, is that you actually have 3 and maybe 4 individual pieces. You have the underlying system of the nervous system in the brain. You have the cause of a disorder or the cause of a change. Don't use the word disorder, let's just call it a change. You have a sign, you have what the sign signifies, and then the fifth thing you have is the interpreter who needs to interpret the sign. There can be a fair bit of ambiguity, and two things can look very, very similar but not be the same. And that's why there's a problem. That's why this is difficult. And that's why people use things like measuring devices to try to get an objective sense, intracranial pressure monitoring, to get an objective sense of what's actually going on in the brain, because from the outside you just can't tell. We don't have that degree. The word I would use is a scientific word, resolution. We don't have the resolution to be able to tell them apart.
Thank you. We have time, I guess, for one more question, or we can... yes. Hilda from KTO.
Not really a question, but maybe more of a comment. When I was listening to you, I was thinking about the conference that I was in, like a half a year ago, maybe in USA, and this was a psychologist conference, okay? What they were talking there was basically that in US, it's very common to drug people due to every single psychiatric or psychological problem and challenge. And they see this as a very big problem because especially with the military who come back from wars, okay, they live on drugs. They take one pill when they wake up, they take, to wake up, then they take to go to sleep, they take pills from pain, etc. So when I was listening to you, I got very similar idea that basically you have to look at certain conditions, challenges, mental problems, also from a social perspective, and basically use encouragement instead of just judging person. Is that right?
You're absolutely right. So you've used a couple of different terms. You've used the term social context and you've used the word judgment. So you need to, if you will, there's a particular problem of military medicine after war. The classic story that's told is the story of the Frenchman who came back to France after World War I, the Englishman who came back to England, and the American who came back to the US. The US had wounded soldiers, but it was untouched by World War I. Britain was physically untouched, but a third of the population, of the male population of fighting age, was destroyed. France was destroyed completely, or Belgium. There was no farming, there were no implements, there were no animals. And so the incidence of all stress-related events in France was far higher than it was in England, which was far higher than it was in the United States. And it proves your point that war and the psychology of people who fight is affected by what they come back to. The problem of post-traumatic stress disorder, and I'm only going to address the military because there are other types of post-traumatic stress disorder as well, in the United States is very, very complicated. On the one hand, until recently, until this administration, the war that was being fought in the Middle East was considered a heroic war. And the people who participated were considered heroes. In this administration, it was not considered to be a war worth fighting. And that change resulted in almost a controlled experiment. Veterans who came back from the first Gulf War in 1991 and stayed in the Gulf until 2000 are very different than those who started in 2000 and came back in 2005, 2006, and those who are coming back now. It's a very, very different experience. And the post-traumatic stress disorder is much worse now than it was before. The social context is both the acceptability of having fought and what happens to people when they try to re-enter society. After the Vietnam War in the United States, there was no point of re-entry for veterans because it was a very unpopular war. That created huge problems. From those who came back in 2001, they had no problems coming back. Those who came back before 2006 had some problems, but nothing like what you see now. The ones who are coming back now have huge problems. And there's probably a 2000 to 2009, 2010 period, a 6-year period, when this has really come to the fore. Do medications help? Yes, they do. They certainly do. Do you use medications for everything? No, because there's a real concern about getting people addicted and because you don't know what all the medications do. The medications also have an effect which is called tachyphylaxis. They work for a while and then they stop working. And the question is, what do you do next? And the answer is probably that you need things like the psychosomatic treatment, the complementary treatment, but above everything else, you also need the social context. There are people who are very damaged, there's no question of it. And one of the things that is true about the soldiers who are coming back now is that many of them have been affected by blasts as opposed to bullet injuries. And the blasts cause concussion and severe concussion. So many of these individuals are now being acknowledged as being victims of severe concussion. And that's part of the spectrum as well. Happy to talk more about it. I don't want to take more time now.
Professor Draghi, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's been a privilege. Thank you very much.